Good evening, everyone. Opencode is a month-long open source event conducted by Geek Haven, the technical society of IIIT Allahabad. It is a perfect blend of rigorous programming, inspiring talks, and brainstorming sessions. At Opencode, we believe that technology can open new doors for our participants and give them the required tools to shine in their careers. Over a period of 1 month, the participants are immersed in intense programming and are encouraged to enhance their imagination to develop innovative and interesting hacks. Established in 1999, the Indian Institute of Information Technology, Allahabad, is globally recognized as a leader in the field of information technology and allied areas by the Government of India. The institute has always focused on giving its students a platform to get the very crucial industrial experience by providing them opportunities to work on real world problems. Geek Haven, our technical society, consists of a group of highly motivated individuals with excellent backgrounds in tech. It has several wings like FOSS, design, web development, app development, AI, and competitive programming that covers the entire domain of the tech world. It tries to instigate a love for tech in students and motivates them to pursue a domain of their liking. IIIT Allahabad has always promoted growth in tech, and Open Code is one such initiative where potential developers from all across the country showcase their skills and take steps to further progress their careers. Open Code, therefore, is the right place for those who wish to learn, expand their networks, and realize their full potential. With assistance and encouragement from mentors who shall be available to guide them throughout, this event gives participants the chance to show off their skills, work with fellow programmers, and learn something new. With this, let us begin with the speaker sessions for today. To kickstart our evening, we have with us David A. Wheeler. He is the Director of Open Source Supply Chain Security at the Linux Foundation, Adjunct Professor at George Mason University, Senior Member of the IEEE, and a Certified Information Systems Security Professional. He is an extremely experienced practitioner and researcher in the field of information and cybersecurity. In his PhD dissertation, he came up with diverse double coupling, an effective countermeasure against the trusting trust attack. Before this, no known countermeasures against the trust attack existed. So we feel extremely honored to have you with us today, sir, and I hand over the virtual stage to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much for having me. Because of time zone differences, it's in the morning for me and the evening for you, but I'm glad that through technology, we're able to have this together. First question, can everyone hear me? Is the audio okay?
Yes, the audio is perfectly fine, at least
Fantastic.
from our end.
Wonderful. Okay, good. So I'm going to be talking about open source software, and I'm going to particularly talk about security and related to open source software and software in general, because that's kind of my particular focus. So first of all, let me briefly explain what open source software is. Open source software is simply software, but it's licensed to users with specific freedoms. The short definition that I like to use is that you can run it for any purpose, you can study it, you can modify it, and you can freely redistribute it, either the original or the modified version, without constraints like royalties to the original author. If you want a full definition, go look at the open source definition. There are many licenses that meet this criterion, but a few are by far and away the most common. Those include the MIT license, the Apache 2.0 license, the BSD 3 clause license, the LGPL, the GPL. If you got software, but it's not open source software, what do you call it? And the answer is typically you call that either closed source or proprietary software. I think it's important to note that a lot of people say it's open source or commercial. That's a little misleading, especially in the US, because under US law, open source software is a kind of commercial software. And open source software, as I'm going to talk about, is used all around the world for all sorts of purposes. So I think it's much better when you don't want to talk about open source, say open source. When you're talking about closed source, talk about closed source. Now, why do people use these licenses? Well, motivations are complicated. Humans are complicated, but they enable worldwide collaborative development of software. And that really is a key aspect of that software today. Open source software is really critical. It's part of everything you use nowadays. Synopsys found that when they did analyses, they could detect open source software 98% of code bases in general or Android apps specifically that contained open source software. And in fact, the majority of the code within these applications is open source software. Depends on a lot of details, but different studies find anywhere from 78 to 90% of the code within an application, even if it as a whole is closed source, is in fact open source software components. And just over the last few years, the number of components in an individual application has been dramatically rising. Now, how is open source software developed? And the quick answer here is that there's a simple model for it. This is the model I tend to use. And I'm going to start in the center. Typically, there's a trusted repository. There's some place where you can get the official version of the software. It may be on GitHub, it may be on GitLab, it may be somewhere else. Those individuals who are formally allowed to or have the authorization to make changes are called trusted developers because they're trusted to make those changes. That code is then distributed out either directly to users or indirectly via distributor. Now, so far, this really isn't different from closed source software, but what's different is that when users complain, when there's something they wish was changed, and users always find something that they'd like changed, they can, instead of just sending a bug report back, they can say, oh, I could make that change. And then once they decide to make that change, they could hold on to it themselves. But most of the costs of software development are in maintenance, not in the original development. Typical studies find that around 80%. So users don't want to take on all that burden of maintenance of those costs. What they can do instead is contribute those improvements back to a trusted developer to put into the trusted repository, and then the project as a whole can maintain that new version. And this provides incentives for users to provide improvements, and if they do that enough times, for they themselves to become trusted developers. And so the goal typically for an open source project is to create an active development and community where you've got a lot of users, some of whom eventually become trusted developers within that community, basically become contributors and eventually maintainers in typical lingo. Now, motivations, as I suggested before, are complicated. Turns out that individuals and organizations often have different motivations, even when they're collaborating on things together. In a 2020 survey that I was part of, these were the top 5 that were listed. I use this software and I needed a particular improvement, or I enjoy learning. Contribute lets me fulfill a need to be creative. I use it. I feel like I should contribute back. I believe in the mission of, hey, I think that things should be more, there should be more open source software, or the particular area I'm contributing to is something I believe in. Slightly over half of those who develop open source software are paid to do that development, typically by their employer. Why do organizations contribute and work with open source, contribute to open source software projects? There's a huge number of reasons for them as well. 2 examples are reducing costs by sharing development of non-differentiating software. I need this software, but it's not actually what I'm my differentiator for what I do. Why don't I reduce costs by sharing its development? Another approach is what's called commoditizing complements. If I can reduce, if more of A produces more of what I sell, I want to make of one thing, then I want to make it as cheap as possible to do the other thing that will increase the use of the thing I actually sell. And here's a URL for more examples of how different open source projects encourage organizational response. All right, let me make a quick aside because it depends on who you talk to, but certainly in the US, and it wouldn't be surprising if the same is true in India, there's a legal phrase that confuses a lot of folks and can get confusing, particularly when we talk about open source. So let me quickly clarify some things. There are many, many laws that involve software. And because those have grown up over many, many years, there's copyright, there's trademark, there's patent, there's trade secret. There's a need for a summary of all those laws that typically apply to software. They're often called intellectual property rights law. And the problem is if you use that phrase, you have to be really careful because that phrase property can be very misleading. Typically, when you think of property, you're thinking an ordinary use, a non-lawyer use, is thinking about a physical object. And if I take your car, which is a physical object, you have no car. But when I copy software, you still have your software, you still have the software. It's not, software, like all data and information, doesn't act like physical products. You can have copies. And economists would call this non-rivalrous. And a failure to understand that intellectual works like software is very different from physical property leads to a lot of confusion, particularly involving open source software. Okay. I realize we're talking, you're in India, the US laws don't apply, but I'd like to point out that while I'm less familiar with Indian laws in India, in the US, the Constitution actually has specific carve-outs for things like intellectual works, because it's known that they're different. I recommend using the term intellectual rights or data rights instead. But if you interact with somebody who says the word property and is using it in the proper legal context, sure. By property, they just mean rights. They don't necessarily mean a physical item. Just understand that can mislead, that can confuse. All right. A quick question. Can you still hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. Okay. So, almost all countries around the world, India, the United States, the European Union, Japan, all have what's called copyright laws, which basically mean you must have permission to copy software. Permission is given by a license. And if you have proprietary software or closed source software, the typical model is you pay for a license to use a copy or a set of copies. Now, open source software licenses by definition grant more rights, but they're still conditional. And while there are over 100 open source software licenses, in practice, only a few get widely used. And they can be grouped into 3 categories: permissive, strongly protective, weakly protective. By permissive, you can take the software and you can actually make a proprietary version of it. The MIT, BSD, and Apache licenses are example of that. Some are what's called strongly protective. You can't create a proprietary version of it. And the usual example of that is the GPL. And then there's weakly protective licenses that try to split the difference between the two. You can't make a proprietary version of this, but you can absolutely link it into a larger proprietary work, no problem. The LGPL is an example of that. And the good news is that the most popular open source software licenses tend to be compatible, which means, when you combine software with many different licenses, that means that you have to comply with all the licenses. Is that possible? And the answer is often yes. Often these licenses are compatible, enabling you to combine them all together and then add whatever you're going to add. There's a persistent myth that open source is always unreliable, and I think that's strange because open source software is often very reliable. There have been a number of studies that have shown that in various ways, open source software is actually much more reliable than some competing software in specific cases. For lack of time, I'm going to speed up here. Another myth is that open source software is either always more secure or it's never more secure. Those are pretty extreme claims. And the reality is that reality is more complicated, right? What a surprise. Neither open source nor proprietary is always better from a security point of view. Now, some specific open source software appear to be more secure. But that doesn't mean it's always true. There is a principle that gives open source software a potential advantage, though. Okay, and that's something called the open design principle. Somebody asks, how do you develop secure software? An expert in the field will immediately start pointing you back to Salzer and Schroeder, who wrote some important papers in the 1970s. And they identified some key principles that are just as true today as they were then. One of the problems, of course, is that software developers tend not to know the principles, but they still apply. And one of those principles, called the open design principle, is that the protection mechanism must not depend on attacker ignorance. Turns out that attackers don't stay ignorant. They don't tell defenders when they've learned something. And having a mechanism that works even when the attacker knows exactly how the system works, is so much more secure, so much safer. And open source software better fulfills this principle. First of all, there's a theory called the many eyes theory. With many eyes, many reviewers, you can find problems and more easily fix them than otherwise. And yes, it absolutely can work. In fact, it's surprising that people think it can't work, because academic science, engineering, they're already based on peer review, the idea that multiple people can look at things and determine whether or not something is good or not good. Now, that doesn't mean that a particular program is evaluated, so you can't assume this. You have to go actually, apply good principles. But it does make it at least possible to do things that are hard to do otherwise. Now, I know that some people have said, oh, wait, how could open source software be secure? Doesn't hiding the source code make it more secure? And the short answer is no. Hiding source code doesn't halt any attacks. First of all, this assumes that you can keep source code secret at all. Increasingly, that's just not true. Attackers often can get it from a variety of ways. Many attacks, though, don't need source code. They often don't even need the executables. In many cases, simply observing outputs from inputs is enough to attack. Even if you don't have the source code, you can actually analyze the executables. You can regenerate source code from using something called a disassembler. So this whole idea of security by obscurity is really widely denigrated by the experts in the field. It doesn't work very well in most circumstances. Now, it's true that hiding source code slows down the response to a vulnerability, but that's not a positive. That's a negative. That's actually a problem. And vulnerability secrecy fundamentally doesn't halt attacks. Multiple people typically refine vulnerabilities. In 2014, there's a major vulnerability in OpenSSL called Heartbleed. It was actually found more or less at the same time by two different organizations on two different continents using two different approaches. I'm a big believer in, if you find a vulnerability, trying to keep it secret for, say, 10 to 30 days while you fix it, but don't expect that you're going to get months or years before an attacker finds it. There are many people who claim that open source software can't possibly be as closed source software, and then give rationales, but most of them, frankly, look kind of dubious. Hey, experienced developers produce better results. Actually, that's true, but that's not a differentiator. A lot of open source software developers are quite experienced. There's no guarantee that open source is widely reviewed. That's absolutely true. Unreviewed open source software can be very insecure. By the way, that's exactly true for closed source software. Most closed source software isn't reviewed either. So, review is very, very valuable. That's just true for software. It doesn't matter what the licensing model is. I've also heard hey, I can sue the vendor if it's insecure or inadequate or whatever. Most such suits don't go anywhere. And most of the times you wanted software and not a lawsuit. So now let me briefly talk about security preconditions for dealing with unintentional vulnerabilities, because I really want to focus on security here. Your developers or reviewers need security knowledge. That's more important than licensing. They have to actually review the code, and then the problems have to be fixed. I could go into details, but for lack of time, I'm going to move a little quickly here. Now, how about inserting malicious code? Anyone can modify open source software, including attackers. That's absolutely true. It's also true for closed source software, proprietary software. If you take a file that has a proprietary software, you can edit it. There's something called a hex editor. It's really not a problem. Now, you might say, oh my gosh, editing a proprietary program, that may be illegal in my country. Yeah, the attackers don't care. Okay? Legal niceties are not protection against someone who's going to violate the law anyway. And modifying the code is not really the issue. The trick is to get it into the user's supply chain so that other users get, because it doesn't matter if your local copy is malicious. What the attacker is trying to do is get other people to run the malicious code. Now, in open source software, that means that you have to subvert or mislead the trusted developers or the trusted repository or the process of distribution and nobody else noticing. Now, while there's different kinds of threats, the good news is that distributed source code aids detection, and large community-based open source projects tend to have a lot of reviewers from many countries, which makes undetected subversion a lot more difficult. Now, it is true that if it's a single person project, the risk is larger. So that's one of the differentiators. That doesn't mean that single person projects are necessarily high risk. But the one of the advantages of open source software is when you have multiple people reviewing things. And if you don't have that, then you have a potential weakness. Now, what about inserting malicious code in open source software? Turns out that open source software repositories have demonstrated a lot of resilience against attacks. Attackers tried to slip some malicious code into the Linux kernel in 2003. The attacker tried to insert some code, but used a single equal instead of a double equal. But in fact, the whole attack failed. There's various repositories which have been attacked, and basically, attackers were unable to actually make any undetected changes. More recently, in 2021, University of Minnesota graded some intentional attacks, tried to get them into the Linux kernel, and the Linux kernel developers immediately detected and rejected the vulnerabilities. It's true that malicious code can be made to look unintentional, but now all the ways to detect unintentional vulnerabilities still apply. It's interesting to note years ago, there was something called Borland Interbase or Firebird, where there was code that, frankly, for all the world, looks like a backdoor, where the user politically password correct made the person connecting in suddenly the administrator of the database system. It was hidden in the proprietary product for 7 years. Nobody found it. When it was released as open source software, the people who started reviewing it found it in 5 months. Now, what this shows is that releasing as open source software really can result in review that finds not just unintentional vulnerabilities, but backdoors. So, open source software is increasingly included in all software. There's increasingly more of it. It's often as secure as closed source. But here's the thing. As we're incorporating more and more and more open source software into larger applications, first of all, we want to make sure those are not only as secure, but we want even more, because we keep using more and more and more of it. We really need that to be incredibly strong. Insecure open source software hurts all. So many other people are working on various efforts to make, it's not that open source software is a disaster. I think that's a misreading, but because we all depend on it, we're increasingly depending on it, we need to make it really good. So let me do a quick shout out about the Open Source Security Foundation, the OpenSSF. This little goose there, here we go. Here's my prop, is the mascot. Oh, by the way, this is the Linux kernel mascot, Tux. Okay, so the OpenSSF is a global initiative. It secures investment, resources, expertise, and the goal of it is to improve the security of open source software, including the supply chain. It's actually part of the Linux Foundation, and that's the organization I work for. Now, how does the OpenSSF do that? Well, it's committed to collaboration and working with upstream existing communities. The goal is not to just take over other people's projects. That's not the goal at all. The goal is to work with others to improve software, open source software security. And if nobody's working on something, then step in and try to do some things to shore that gap up. OpenSSF has done a lot, including releasing some guides. So let me briefly talk about some guides. One guide that they've recently released is a concise guide for developing more secure software. And notice that it's not just open source software. It's just how do you develop secure software in general, because open source software is just software. And how do you develop secure software? For the most part, it's the same thing, no matter what the licensing model is. So first of all, hey, get all your privileged developers to use multi-factor authentication tokens. Attackers are trying to, one thing attackers are trying to do is break into developer accounts to take over. That's and then do all sorts of terrible things. So get one of these tokens. The OpenSSF has actually given away some tokens to many existing open source software developers, specifically to encourage this. Learn about secure software development. One of the most important things to do to develop secure software is to know how to do it. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Use a combination of tools in your pipeline to detect vulnerabilities. Tools will not detect everything. Some reports will be false positives. That said, tools are an important part of the process. Before you bring in software, evaluate it. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Unfortunately, software is made by humans, and humans sometimes make mistakes. Okay, that's just a reality, and we're taking a number of steps to reduce the likelihood of vulnerabilities or their impact. But we anticipate that they're still going to happen. So we need for projects, when they bring in software, open source software or not, to be ready to rapidly update when a known vulnerability is found. How do you do that? Well, use package managers. That automates your management of the software you depend on. Implement automated tests so that you know whether or not the software works when you update a component it depends on. That means it needs to be high coverage, cover most of your code and requirements, and include what we call negative tests. In other words, make sure that things that aren't supposed to happen are checked for. A lot of people only test the things that are supposed to work. But for security, you want things like, I can't delete someone else's data on a system. Well, if that's something that's supposed to happen, then you need to test for that. Monitor for known vulnerabilities in your software's direct and indirect dependencies. There are tools for that, and try to keep them reasonably up to date. There's many more, including the use of the best practices badge and OpenSSF scorecards. I'll talk more about that in a moment. When you're bringing in software, typically what you're most of the time when you're bringing in reused software, it's open source software. How do you evaluate it? Well, here's 9 criteria that the OpenSSF Best Practices Working Group came up with. I think these high-level criteria are the same for any kind of software, open source or not. But if you look in this document, what's different is how you get this information. For open source software, there's a lot more information about the project than there would be for a proprietary project. And that's great, but a lot of people don't know how to get that information and evaluate. So, not just, hey, here are things you should consider, but this is how you get that kind of information, an open source software project, because the good news is that a lot of this is actually not that hard to find. It's available. Another thing that the OpenSSF did, one of the first things that the OpenSSF did is released a free course on how to develop secure software. Take about 14 to 18 hours to go through the 3 parts. And it teaches the fundamentals of developing secure software, whether it's open source or not. And you can blame me. I'm the lead author of it, but I think it's important. What does it cover? It covers things like design principles. How do you look at your designs to make sure that they're more resistant to attacks? Using accept lists and not deny lists to constrain any untrusted inputs. Before you bring in input from an untrusted source, check it carefully, greatly restrict what can come in. That really eliminates a lot of attacks. Know what the common types of vulnerabilities are, how to prevent each one. Harden up your software so that bugs are less likely to become vulnerabilities. That sort of thing. So it's a set of very small modules, both with quizzes. So it's very, very easy to get started. It's very easy to keep going. And you can get a free certificate via LF training when you're done to show that you actually learned the material. Okay. The OpenSSF Best Practices Badge is another project of the OpenSSF. What it does is identifies best practices for open source software projects, and with the goal of improving quality and security. Things like your project sites have to support HTTPS. You have to have at least one automated tool suite. There has to be at least one static code analysis tool, because yes, they miss things. Sometimes their reports will be wrong, but they're still very, very helpful at finding problems before you dump them on the users. Okay. And the project must publish the process for reporting vulnerabilities. Right now, this is actually our biggest problem, is getting people to tell everybody else how to report vulnerabilities. And if an open source software project meets these criteria, it can earn a badge. There's actually 3 badge levels: passing, silver, gold, and we particularly at least want people to get the passing level badge. And it's a combination of self-cert and automated checks and spot checks. So it's filling a form, but we'll actually can evaluate some of those answers and reject some answers and automatically fill in some in cases where we can automate them. We've got over 5,100 participating projects, over 900 who've received at least a passing badge. OpenSSF scorecards automatically scores open source software projects based on a bunch of heuristics. Each of them are scored from 0 to 10, and then there's a weighted average computed. The idea is to try to give you a brief numeric sense of the of at least the project's approach to security. More process oriented, but some product oriented as well. And here's some of the sample checks. Things like, hey, is it free of checked in binaries? If it has them, then it may not be building them, and that raises all sorts of concerns. Does it use something called branch protection? So basically forcing people to post things separately and enable review before a change is merged in. You'll notice that the best practices badge is one of those criteria. As well as code reviews, does have tests, does have contributors from different organizations. So those are all the sorts of things that it wants to look for, that it looks for. All right, and with that, so let me briefly talk about likely future directions for computing, for open source software, and for Linux. So I've talked a lot about open source software. I've really focused in on security because security is really important today. As you know, that we've automated so many different systems and parts critical functions in our society, we depend on those systems to work. So here's some, but I was also asked, hey, can you talk about some future directions? So here is my personal take on some points. So first of all, increasing irrelevance of the desktop. For many, many, many users, the desktop is simply a way to invoke their web browser. That's what it's for. Even on mobile devices, yes, there are a number of people who've got a number of apps, but often there's no need for a native application with its associated maintenance cost. I haven't checked recently, but at least in the past, the UK actually had a rule on itself that they forbid the creation of native applications for mobile apps without a waiver. And the reason was they were finding they had to develop an application 3 times: the web application, the iPhone application, the Android application. They said, you know, why are we developing it 3 times? We will reduce our costs by 1/3 if we just develop the web application, because the mobile phones can access the web application. The desktops can access the web application. Now, that's not always true. Native applications are always going to have a place. There's always going to be cases where you need a native application. You can't just do it with web applications. But on the other hand, that's becoming increasingly niche, especially on the desktop. Are there cases where you need it? Yes, absolutely. But you know, some people have asked me, hey, when's the year of the Linux desktop? I've run many Linux desktops for years. I have I have a Mac and I have a virtual machine with running Linux right now. And I do a lot of work within that Linux virtual machine, but increasingly it doesn't matter because I'm invoking things on a web browser, and then what's running on the other end is often Linux, but the user doesn't know. Increasing focus on security and supply chain. Hopefully I've really emphasized that already, but you know, it's something that I've talked to many different organizations, many different governments about. Increasing shift to memory safe languages instead of primarily C and C++. So I'll need to explain this a little bit. Microsoft did a study over a number of years, and Chrome separately did their own study. And they both found, so these are completely different organizations with completely different software, but they both found that about 70% of all the vulnerabilities they had to deal with were due to a particular problem called memory safety problems. Now, it turns out that most programming languages are memory safe by default, but there are some exceptions. Most of them are rarely used languages like Forth, but C and C++ are widely used and they are not memory safe. So there is increasing interest in starting to shift, and yes, that means rewrite code to shift to memory safe languages. Now, this is hard to do, especially when performance matters. Historically, most memory safe languages, you had to trade off either a little bit or a lot for performance. You know, a program written in Java or Python or Ruby is, you know, it can often be just fine, but they're not generally going to get the performance of a program written in C and C++ if it's optimized to do so. But progress has been made. There are languages which really do get C and C++ like performance. Rust is probably the biggest darling, but there's others like Ada and Fortran. So this is not a new concept. But a lot of people have, you know, I don't like the trade-offs when I want a memory safe language. But increasingly, people are moving even in those cases where the performance needs are really critical. So, for example, the Linux kernel has begun to add support for drivers in Rust. The second version of the release of the Linux kernel with some Rust support has already happened. This is expected to be a multi-year process. It's not going to be done today. The Linux kernel is complex, generally at the level that people that operating systems are done at. By far and away, usually it's almost always written in C. So using another language, while certainly it's been done many times before, trying to do it in a performant way is rare and almost a and so this is a big change. And others are also in progress. Curl is increasingly enabling the ability to use Rust for significant portions. Others are doing the same. So I think this is not one of those things that's going to happen in a year. This is a thing that's going to happen over a long term. And for the most performant needs, I see Rust as the most likely, as the one language that's getting the most out of that. But a lot of the people are choosing other languages like Python, say, which sure, it's not quite as performant as C and C++, but you often get close enough for real world uses, and you completely avoid these problems. I see increasing use of and requirements eventually for software bill of materials. Fundamentally today, modern software products are mostly reused components. Many decades ago, typically people, when they wrote some software, they would rewrite everything. And people knew at the time that that was a crazy thing to do, but there weren't any obvious alternatives. Today, we do have an alternative. We're using software, in particular open source software. And that's great. That's enabled far more sophisticated software than we've been able to economically develop in the past. However, this means that increasingly any known vulnerabilities in those reused components become a primary issue. If you reuse some other component A that depends on component B that depends on component C, somebody might find a vulnerability in component C, it becomes known to the public, and now you've got to update that component. How do you do that? Well, end users often have no idea that that component C is deeply embedded inside. This is one of the issues with a problem called log4shell. It's a vulnerability in a logging component, but that logging component is often deeply embedded inside software. It's not something that typical users would even know existed in there. So users are increasingly demanding a way to find out independently what components are in there, because we want to have some confidence that you've dealt with known vulnerabilities. And so the U.S. government has already demanding this. The European Union is moving at demanding them as well, basically asking for software organizations to provide not just the software, but an SBOM. What's the list of components within it? This enables transparency so that they can find out what's really going on and figure out their risks. Now, this I think has great potential, but this is a really big change in the industry. It's hard for me to stress enough that in general, no one has done that in the past. And now you're asking organizations around the world to make a change that doesn't directly benefit themselves, but benefits the end user organization, which may not be the organizations they talk to. So this is going to be hard. This is going to be a challenge, but there's a lot of work to make this happen. I don't think this is going to be done in a year. I know some people think, oh, I just asked for an SBOM and it magically appears. That's not how this is going to happen. But I think this is a possible thing, and people are working on it. Increasing use of SigStore. I really didn't talk about it, but there's a project called SigStore, another OpenSSF project, to enable digital signatures of software assets. Digital signing's been around for decades, but the verification's just been too hard. The signing's been too hard, and so people generally don't do it. SigStore is taking a different approach to make it much easier. And finally, a potentially increased use of verified reproducible builds. There are many ways that attackers try to attack software. One of the far less common ones today is subverting what's called the build process, the process of turning source code into executable code. But unfortunately, attackers are doing it. There's an attack called SolarWinds, which really demonstrated this. And as we address some of these other security issues and make software harder to attack that way, I think attackers always go for the easiest thing to attack. So as we squeeze out these other attacks, I think attackers are going to increasingly try to focus on attacking the build processes. And so I think over time, eventually we're going to get to the point where verified reproducible builds will be necessary or will be important to counter subverted builds. And with that, that's my last slide. All right, so I'm going to stop my, I'm going to stop, at least pull out of this. I'm not sure I should stop presenting yet. So my goal here was to give a presentation and then give time for some questions. So now is my turn to say, please ask questions.
Okay, so I will be bringing you the questions that have come to us from our YouTube
Okay,
live
wonderful.
chat. So
Okay.
we have a question from Keshav Gupta, and he's asking, can you share some of your experience working with the Linux Foundation for the open source community?
Can I share some? Sure. Wow, it's a big question because in fact that's what I do all day. That is literally my job, is to interact with we're actually open source communities or their users. So let's see here. I have several different kinds of interactions, and so maybe that's the best way to try to group them. I do a lot of work. I'm wondering if I should stop presenting. I can restart if it turns out that that's important. Okay. All right. So at the Linux Foundation, my job is to try to improve the security of open source software, okay, writ large. One of the ways I do that today is I spend a lot of time, really the majority of my time, with the Open Source Security Foundation, because that's also their mission. And so my job is to help them be successful. I can't do everybody's stuff, but I've learned a lot of stuff. This is my specialty area and has been for decades. So I have a lot of information that can help the other folks who are also working on this. So the OpenSSF has a number of working groups inside. They've got a number of projects and special interest groups that have been identified to work on various areas. I show up in a lot of meetings, try to help them get things done. I pick up some work in certain cases to do some things, particularly if, it's not sure who else can do that. I will try to pick up some of those things. I lead the best practices badge work. I lead the efforts to keep the course on how to develop secure software up to date. Now, what about other places? I do a lot of speaking, to be honest with you, like today. Okay. Through the magic of the internet, I'm speaking to you in India. I've never been to India, by the way. Someday I hope to get there because I would really love to be there. But I do need to be careful about what I ask for, because the last 2 weeks I was in Brussels and then went to Tokyo. Both were both awesome, but I live near Washington, D.C. So by the end of that, I was kind of tired and sore. But this is not really a complaint, because basically I got to interact with some governments who are trying to figure out policies that make sense, because they don't want to screw up open source, but they also want to make sure that the way open source software is used in a reasonable way, that good practices are encouraged. Same in Tokyo, where we met with a number of companies which use open source software in Japan. And they want to, and they help fund the OpenSSF work and some other work to encourage the improvement of the open source software that they depend on, or in the case of the governments depend on. And then I show up and order things like this, or trying to get information and get the word out, pointing you to where the information would be. So hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the craziness. And I work with other Linux foundations also. I've worked over the last couple of years with LF Energy, LF Public Health, Chaos, which works on identifying metrics, because there are security related and sustainment and risk related metrics that would be good to define. And I'm sure there are many others, and I'm embarrassed to admit I can't remember them all. So I'll just stop there. Okay, does that help?
I believe so. Okay, so our next question is from Harsh Sharma. He is asking us, what advice would you have for people who are interested in contributing to open source projects?
Oh, okay. I love that question because please do. And there is a lot. I mentioned the different motivations that people have. There are lots of wonderful benefits to just contributing a little bit. But how do you contribute? Well, I think the quick step is figure out what you want to contribute to. Is there some software that you use or some mission that you is there some mission of some software that you really agree with? And then show up. Now, most open source software projects today are hosted on what's called a forge. Things like GitHub and GitLab and so on, where it's just a website, and the website manages the version control and the list of issues, including the bugs and such. Okay, and proposed changes, which are typically called either pull requests or merge requests. Okay, what's an easy thing to do is find a project you believe in, look at the issues that it already has, see if you could help. Okay. Many projects, and we encourage this, actually have markers for first-time contributors, where there's an identified project we know isn't going to be too hard, and we're going to wait and see if someone who is less experienced with the project is willing to come in and help. And by the open source software projects will even take non-code contributions, by the way. If you're willing to write documentation, there's a large number of people who either aren't willing or are terrible at it. So even if it is not crazy to start with documentation. In fact, a trick that I often use when I don't know something is I will try to write about it, because the process of writing about it helps you learn about it. And even if you intend to do code contributions, and given this particular forum, I'm guessing that most people will be more interested in code contributions. It's not bad at all to start with a documentation contribution, and then maybe look at the issues, run a tool to look at for potential problems, try to fix some of those. Okay. Many of these projects will be delighted. And in particular, I think the main thing to be concerned about is trying not to be a drag on the project, but trying to be a net benefit. It's okay to ask questions, but if you ask so many questions that they're basically doing all the work for you, that's not really fair. You're not really aiding. So what you want to do is try to, as far as you can yourself. Okay, when you get stuck, ask, do the searches first, see if that helps you. And if that doesn't, then absolutely ask for help. There's no shame in asking for help. People expect that. Just try to do what you can yourself first without too much effort, and then go ahead and ask the questions. Now, more specifics. Most projects have what's called a contributing guide. They'll often have a contributing.md file, and it will tell you the nuts and bolts and often link to instructions. So, once you figure out what you're going to change and you make, and you start making that change, there's some specifics about how to say contribute on GitHub or GitLab. Most people who develop software use the tool Git today, GIT, for version control. So learning a little bit about Git is a very, very wise idea. Basically follow whatever process it is that they document for making a proposal. Generally, what most of them want is, come up with a very focused change for a particular thing. If there's 10 different things you'd like to do, create 10 different merge requests or 10 different pull requests. That way, for example, they may totally agree with you on one and disagree with you on another. And that they can immediately bring in the one change they totally agree with. And then we can have a discussion about the other ones and not get confused about the different parts. Okay. More questions.
So next question is from, that person has put their name as Erin Diego. So, having experience in system security, can you share some interesting security related things which normally people would never know about? That's a very open-ended question.
It is a very open-ended question. So open-ended questions can be hard because you're kind of, oh my. there's all sorts of weird and strange vulnerabilities and such. Obviously, I actually do oversee some of the security audits that we do on some open source software. For obvious reasons, I can't talk about things that have not been revealed yet. So let me talk about something that's old enough that I don't have to worry about that kind of issue, and that would be Heartbleed. Heartbleed was a vulnerability in OpenSSL, which is a widely used library for cryptography and in particular for TLS support. Heartbleed was a weird thing because lots and lots of people had run tools on OpenSSL to look for vulnerabilities and didn't find this one. So Heartbleed sat as a vulnerability for quite some time before it was found. And the Heartbleed was what's called an overread. Usually when you hear a buffer overread, usually when you hear about buffer overflow problems, you hear about buffer overwrites, which can be big problems. But this one was odd. Historically, up to that point, people didn't worry very much about buffer overreads because, hey, you can just read data. That's not good. We agree that's not good. But I mean, what would be the impact of that? But in fact, OpenSSL, the fundamental problem, there's an XKCD cartoon that's awesome that explains it, where basically you said, hey, here's some data, please send it back to me, and here's how many characters it is. Okay. And unfortunately, it didn't check that the data and the number of characters it asked for matched. And so you could say, hey, here's bug, reply back 3,000 characters. And so it would reply back internal data. Now, again, is a buffer overread. What could be the problem? Well, OpenSSL controlled the TLS implementation, which meant it had direct access to the secret keys and and the certificates. And so, in fact, the answer is it's really bad in the case where you can easily trigger revelation of secrets. And it revealed some other things too. I actually have a paper about this. Maybe I should post a link to that while we're chatting here. But I actually did an analysis about Heartbleed, and there's a paper on my website about how to prevent the next Heartbleed. Here, I'll post a link right now. There we go. Where basically, I think every time you look at vulnerabilities, especially in your own code, but really anybody else's code, you should look and say, what can we learn? How can we prevent those kinds of problems in the future? And one lesson in particular, for example, was this was analyzed with static code, but the OpenSSL code was so overly complex that most static analysis tools really struggled and failed to do a good job analyzing it. And so since that time, I mean, I will certainly not say they fixed everything, but they have taken some efforts to simplify the code, not just because it makes it easier for humans to analyze it, although that's important, but also because it makes it easier for computers to analyze it. So I can talk more about that, but I think that hopefully gives at least an answer to the question.
So, so Yash Gupta is asking us if you can discuss any examples of open source projects that have made significant contributions to the field of security.
Okay, open source software projects that make contributions to the field of
security.
What?
Security.
Oh, security. Okay, all right. Oh my goodness.
Lots of open-ended questions.
Yeah, that's open-ended. It's not bad. It's just a little. I have to kind of think hard on this. Security. I mean, a lot of this stuff has become invisible specifically because this releases open source software. It used to be, for example, that firewalls were a complicated thing. Now everybody's router has built-in firewall capabilities, and that's typically because most of these routers today are implemented with Linux. Linux comes with built-in mechanisms to implement firewalls. In fact, you basically get a firewall with most default configurations, and that. Well, I think the value of network-based protections is slowly fading. I think that has been important for a long time. Biggest one, let me go. So that's a specific one, but let me reply back. I think that's not the best answer, though. I think the best answer, frankly, is the broader answer, which is the idea that you can review software publicly to find and fix vulnerabilities. I think that has been the biggest win. It's not any one tool. There are a lot of open source software tools that focus on security, and I would have to give a long list, but I think broader, the review by others is an incredibly powerful tool. I think those who've never seen it, I don't think appreciate just how powerful it is to have other experts look at it, many different tools, analyze software, because you can find problems that any one of those other things wouldn't have. And the result is incredible wins for security. Now, there's a caveat, as I mentioned earlier. The people reviewing the code have to know how to write secure software. That's actually one of the biggest problems. Today, most software developers don't. But that's a fixable problem. Okay, that's an education problem. They're not always using tools to look for problems. That's fine. There's lots of tools available, different circumstances. Go stick some tools in. But I think we are well on our way towards making things much better. I think we have time for at least one more, and I can stick around a little longer if you're willing to let me. I can stick around. I don't have anywhere else to go, so you're welcome if you want me to.
There's one question I personally wanted to ask you. I'm a second-year student myself, so
sure.
I don't know if you've heard of it. So there's this programming language called Agda, AGDA.
Wait a minute, spell it for me, please.
AGDA, the Agda programming language.
AGDA.
I'll write it down.
Agda. Oh my goodness. I know over 100 programming languages, and that isn't one of them. I'm disappointed in myself. Tell me about Agda then.
So Agda has this very beautiful idea that, so there's this theorem in mathematics. It's called the Curry-Howard isomorphism.
Yes, I know that.
So what Agda does, it exploits the Curry-Howard isomorphism to ensure that your code is mathematically correct.
Yeah, okay, yeah, it's okay. I'm looking at Wikipedia, dependently typed functional programming language. Oh, okay, all right. There's a number of those, but that's fine. Yeah, okay. So first of all, I'm not familiar with Agda. There are other programming languages I do know, like Haskell and OCaml.
That's good enough. Honestly.
Okay, all right. So I mean, and indeed, although I think people often discount this for reasons I don't completely understand. Scheme and Common Lisp are functional programming languages. So now it depends on how you use them, but so functional programming is absolutely a thing. So I actually have I teach on how to develop secure software, and I actually spend typically like 2 whole lectures on formal proofs and formal methods. So there's a couple things here I want to comment on. First of all, formal methods is the application of mathematics to programming itself, to be able to do things like prove that a model of a program is correct, or even prove that a program is correct given certain assumptions. Okay, it has tremendous potential, because today, if it's really important that something absolutely be true, it's something be absolutely secure by certain measures, it is the only way we know how to do it. Okay, testing doesn't do it. You can't even test the program to add 2 numbers within the life of the universe if you are demanding that the testing be thorough and test all inputs. Okay, we don't have any other mechanism. However, formal methods have gotten, I think, many people aren't aware of formal methods because they take a tremendous amount of effort to apply. There has been a lot of research over the last couple decades and some very significant algorithmic improvements, particularly involving SAT solvers, that have really changed the game in terms of, okay, it's not trivial, but we are starting to see cases where it is slowly becoming easier. Now, it is true that it's typically easier to apply these approaches to functional programming languages, and I think that's more an explanation of the limitations of mathematics. We've had mathematics for thousands of years. Nobody ever thought to apply mathematics to programming languages written on a computer until recently. So a lot of mathematics takes certain approaches involving functions, and so it's a little easier to apply on programming languages that apply to functions. So there's legitimate disagreement on how to take these methods and make them easier to apply to larger and larger cases. Some folks want to program in functional programming languages directly, and I totally respect that. There's a good argument for that. And functional programming languages definitely have some advantages. They do have some disadvantages too. Don't let people fool you. There has advantages, it has disadvantages, like many other things. I am actually rather a fan of the Proval, used to be our Takata approach based on Y3, where what they do is they've implemented several different approaches where you write in a more traditional programming language like C or Ada or Rust, okay, or Java, okay, and then they have a system that converts that into a variant of ML, which is a functional programming language. And then they use that and then to figure out the verification conditions and then farm out those to various provers. What's interesting about that approach is that people can use more traditional programming languages, but still take advantage of these formal methods approaches. I think that right now, formal methods is actually applicable today to niche areas where it's super, super critical. Things like crypto libraries and crypto protocols and certain other narrow fields. I also think that there's good reason to believe that we're going to be able to grow and grow and grow that space. We're finally seeing some real progress in that area. I'm not sure we're ever going to see the case where we see multi-million line programs approved. I don't see that happening. But I do see cases where maybe a model of it could be analyzed. But more specifically, I see this slow growing of formal methods. And now, where does Agna fit in? I don't know. I mean, if Agna's a type functional programming language, there's others in that space. Hey, let 1,000 flowers bloom on the programming languages, because all the problems are not solved yet.
So what I wanted to talk about, you basically answered. I just wanted to ask, what do you believe do you believe formal methods are applicable? So of course not yet, because I remember I wrote a proof for quicksort, a formal proof for quicksort, and that took me nearly 1 week.
Yeah. I've done this too. I've done. I remember the first time I did a hand proof. It wasn't even quicksort. It was I think it was binary search, but it's one of those standard programs that you do. I don't remember which one it was, but basically, it took me a week to do by hand a formal proof, and went, oh man, it's cool that I think it is so cool it's possible, and this is never going to happen. So first of all, tools are the answer. There is no way this is going to be done by hand. Okay, that just many things you can at least do some things by hand, maybe just for an understanding of how it works, but no, this has to be done by tools, and a lot of tools. And now, while people disagree, I think it's more likely to be a set of tools working together rather than one Uber tool. People used to try to make Uber tools that did everything, and that turns out to be a pretty fragile approach to doing things. So that's one of the things I see. But I do see formal methods are already used today. You can't say they're not used. They're already used today. Amazon, if you're using Amazon, if you use, say, S3, okay, you're already using a program that's been formally proved. Okay? Amazon's written several proofs for several of its programs. They happen to use another system, but called TLA Plus, but it doesn't matter. The point, though, is that there are various tools that are out there that people are already using. So formal methods is already here. It's already being used. It is absolutely a minority special case. Why? Because of the costs and effort. And I do think that we have, in some sense, kind of gotten over a hump where it has at least enough uses where more people are investing, and that will make it better and better. There's many, many other cases. I would encourage you to read about The Innovator's Dilemma. It's a really great book. about innovations, where basically something that's not good for many other cases, but it's good for a special case. And over time, once you finds a niche, you can keep improving it until it becomes more and more applicable. I think there's reason to believe that in the longer term, formal methods are going to be there. It's not going to be next week. But I do think that we're going to slowly see increased use of formal methods. And I certainly encourage learning more about that. That said, that's not something you're going to see in most software projects today. And but it's something I would like to see more of in the future.
Because, I mean, in my opinion, as software gets more complex, testing would simply become infeasible at some point.
Yes, but that's actually not that's not an argument for formal methods. That's actually an argument against it, because formal methods, and again, this is in part because of the current limitations of the tools. And as we reduce the limitations of the tools, maybe this won't be a problem. But today, typically, you have to write the software. If it's going to be proved, you have to write it with the mind of writing it so that the prover can prove it correct, because it's so hard for the tools to do this. First of all, you can't do it manually practically. You can't, I mean, in theory you could. No one's ever going to do that. It takes too much time. So you have to use tools. But today's tools, while it's amazing they work at all, they really struggle. And so you end up having to make a lot of either compromises or sacrifices. Some may even say that using functional languages is a compromise. Basically, you're choosing a tool because you're choosing a programming language because it's easier for the formal method tool, not because that's actually what you wanted to do. Okay, so and complexity is actually a problem, because as the software gets more and more complex, the proofs get more and more complicated, and increasingly it becomes too difficult to practically do in economic time with the tools. Now, how do you deal with that? Well, there's various ways to back that off. One is, I'm not going to prove it about the program. I'm going to talk about a model of the program at a high level and then analyze that. That's actually not a crazy thing. It's what all other engineering disciplines do. You generally are not going to be allowed to build a bridge today, in at least, in a modern society, without first running it through some sort of tool to analyze it. I'm talking about the kinds of bridges where they're big and you've got an architect and you're putting cars over it and so on. As soon as you start talking about big and designs, it's basically you can't get it approved without having a model created and then analyzed with computers. And so I think the same may be true in certain cases. Eventually, and developing software is a kind of engineering. You're trying to solve human problems using resources available. That's engineering. So I think that may be one out. But yeah, as stuff gets increasingly complex, formal methods can help you prove it's correct if you can, but that the tooling limitations today mean that really you first need to make your software simple enough and your models simple enough. And I think there's good reasons to make your software simple enough anyway. So I'll stop there, I guess.
The discussion is getting a little, we went on a tangent, so to speak.
Oh, so, it's actually relevant because a huge amount of the software involving formal methods today is open source software, and I think actually that's really helped formal methods. Historically, one of the other problems with formal methods is that organization like colleges would be funded to write some software, and they would write the software barely enough to write a paper. And then they would say, oh man, formal methods, that's going to be an amazing thing. We're going to patent the heck out of this and send us millions of dollars for this tool that barely works. And, shockingly, nobody was going to do that. And the patenting just meant that it would prevent further work. And I mentioned the SAT solver. SAT solving is a well-known computer science problem. It's actually proven NP complete. It's actually the original NP complete problem. And so people for a long time said, wow, it's NP complete, too hard. I guess we'll never find an algorithm that'll be good at it. But in the early 2000s, somebody said, it's NP complete, but there's so many problems that are fundamentally SAT solving problems. Why don't we find an algorithm that works fine for normal cases? Yes, it's in extreme cases it will not work. But for the cases that people care about, can we find an algorithm for that? And they did. And then they wrote a paper. But the paper published couldn't be reproduced. People could not reproduce the algorithm, and people were starting thinking, well, maybe this is a hoax. I mean, how does this work? And then they finally released the code. And suddenly, and suddenly, there's actually somebody wrote a little article about this, basically saying, "Oh wait, now we understand how this works." The paper's helpful, but what's really helpful in the world of computer science, when you want to express an idea, is code. That's how we express ideas, and if you have documentation and papers, those are helpful. But the code was necessary, and once the code was released, many other people have implemented the SAT solving algorithms, have made improvements on them, and it's just made a big game changer. And a lot of things now depend on this stuff. So I think we're going to see more and more releases of code, and that releasing of code has really accelerated the formal methods world, which historically wasn't doing that often, and that was really to its detriment. But now that we suddenly figure that sharing code, looking at other people's code, can actually help progress and making it so you can improve that code. I mentioned, Proval Decada, where, Y3 is open source. It can call out to a lot of other programs, which are different programs. Each of them are also open source. Each of them focuses on specific areas. And that means that you don't have to have a genius to write all the code and know everything. You can have different groups working together on different problems, and yet all ending up working together to come up with a solution.
Okay, so let's return to the chat. So Buddy Long Legs is asking us, what is your favorite Linux distribution?
Oh, now you're asking somebody which is your favorite baby, which is your favorite child. That's not fair. All right. So I'm not going to give you a single answer, but I will. So why don't I instead point out to some of the distributions that I tend to use the most, and that'll probably be the closest here. So right now, the distro that's running on my computer right now is Ubuntu. I use Debian a lot, especially in my MetaMath work, which is a side hobby of mine. And I use that for a server. I have done a lot of work over the years with Fedora. I've actually created a number of packages on Fedora. I've certainly used Red Hat Enterprise Linux a number of times. And I've worked with the folks who've done Alpine Linux as well. So that at least gets you started. There are certain distributions that are great for different purposes, and really for any software. I try to encourage, think like an engineer. What are you trying to do? What's the best way to get there? Okay. And best way is obviously dependent on what you're trying to do, other, environmental factors and so on. But there's a lot of really awesome Linux distributions out there. And, I encourage you to check out what you're trying to do and then pick one that's reasonable. The good news is that many of the better, more widely used distros, you can pick any one of them and be quite happy. And if you decide later you want to switch, there's a lot less to the switching than you might think. Okay. A lot of the code is the same underneath. And, so that decision, while it's better, it's wise to choose one that is actually supported. Beyond that, there's a lot of good ones available.
So thank you so much, David. And it has been a very insightful session. However, due to the fact that we have time constraints, unfortunately, we have to end this now. So thank you so much, everybody who participated in the Q&A session. If your query could not be answered, please do not lose heart. We cannot possibly, cover everybody's query, but we appreciate you sending your queries to us. So thank you so much for that, and thank you so much, David, for taking the time out to come to us. It has been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so very much for the opportunity. And as I said, I'm hoping to someday get over there in person, because I would really like to do that.
Would love to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So what should I do now? Do I push the lead?